In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at the topic of conflict theory. When we're looking at the notion of conflict, the additional concept that we have to take a closer examination of is the role of power in society. In this case, when a sociologist is talking about power and authority, they are addressing, in this case, the ability to secure compliance. In this case, it would be either a group's ability to have another group or members within that group comply to a particular kind of normative behavior, or it could be on a larger scale or even a historical scale. No matter what the case, compliance is the key. Compliance to criminal law, compliance to normative behavior. It should also be mentioned that when we are talking about compliance, we are also invoking the notion that an individual or a group or a segment of society is unwilling to initially practice that behavior or participate in that behavioral norm. Um, Being unwilling to do that and yet acting in a counterintuitive way to that unwilling behavior or unwilling notion is the key to understanding how conflict theory uh, exists, how it acts in a sense, and how it can be connected to criminal law and ultimately criminology. The notion of conflict theory is an ancient one when we're talking about in this case, sociology. We can connect conflict perspectives to people like Emil Durkheim. We can even connect them to Karl Marx. Conflict and conflict resolution is a topic that is of interest to not only criminologists and members of the criminal justice system, but it is also something that is of interest to, as I said, sociologists, but then also political scientists and historians. George Vold is the first individual that we will take a closer look at, in this case, connecting the notion of conflict in society to criminal law. He is important because he looks at how the law is experienced, not only by the individual, but by the many groups within a society or even between societies. That's the other thing to keep in mind is that, again, scale is important. It can occur at the individual level as people monitor their behaviors and make choices in relation to a behavioral landscape. It can be at the group level, it can be at a society-wide level, it can be at a cultural level, so it can move into that kind of psychological realm, and then it can be across cultures and societies. So this is a very pervasive theoretical school of thought. For our purposes, we must embrace the idea that as a theoretical school of thought rooted in sociology, conflict theory really represents a movement away from understanding criminal behavior um, as and its causes to, in a sense, looking at how the law is established and implemented, how we, in a sense, recognize conflict and then how we resolve that conflict through consensus and where the law fits into that particular process. Now, something important to keep in mind due to this focus on criminal law is how conflict theory connects to research in the criminal justice system. So research can have many different foci in a sense as it relates to how it's being applied. You can take a look at how politicians, how a political landscape reacts to public census or consensus rather as it relates to particular kinds of values. So you can see research having to do with, in this case, legislation. Tied to that, you can have research that focuses on how public opinion is established and how this connects to a changing criminal justice landscape. You can have, in a sense, research that takes a look at how judgments are made and the ramifications of those judgmental processes within criminal justice. And then, of course, how we perceive things that are a threat. So there is rather quite a bit of research looking at how social threat is something that is integrated into the establishment and implementation of criminal law. And all of this research, in a sense, is addressing another kind of centralized topic, which is the notion of not only how laws are formulated, out of what circumstances, what social and historical circumstances laws are formulated, but then over time, how that formulated construct as it relates to deviant behavior and how we relate to that, how that is being applied on a variety of municipal levels. So if we now look through a more postmodern lens at the idea of conflict in society, and we embrace even a kind of economical or historical and an economical point of view, maybe one that Marx and Engels would have adopted, or if we shift our perspectives to the ideas of sociologists such as Thorsten Sellen, who looked at culture conflict and how culture conflict theory connects to the parent theory of conflict theory. If we take a look at this, one thing that we immediately realize is that there is a particular kind of hierarchy that exists in terms of how people not only deal with conflict between themselves and others, between their group and other groups, but then also how they resolve that conflict and how that process of resolving the conflict is also being experienced. So, when you're thinking about a hierarchy, almost how conflict theory relates to things like a class system, one of the first things you have to realize is at the top of this hierarchy, we have the institution. And when we use the term institution, we don't mean, again, a physical building or a physical environment where in this case, practices are being resolved. What we mean in this case is something that is a little more connected to culture and socialization. When we're talking about institutional, in this case, it really means those aspects of culture and society that house social values. And so it's kind of more like a philosophical arena of sorts. That is where the notion of conflicting values really begins, and it is probably, and it is in a sense, something that is furthest removed from the everyday experience of how conflicts are being resolved. Below that, then, we have a level where crime is being experienced, and it's generally going to be experienced differently. And this is where we're really into the larger scale units of a society. You may have people who are recognized because of median income for a household to be part of an upper class or middle class or lower class. They will experience crime in a very different way, or they will experience deviance in a very different way. How that is being experienced will very much establish the social values that households and people within those households, within that particular way of slicing up the society, how they will perceive, in a sense, law and the rule of law. And then kind of the last level relates to the enforcement process. So once we have established a rule of law, and again, it will connect to a variety of institutional, historical, and cultural kinds of sentiments. It will then also connect to segments within a society. I gave class, socioeconomic class, as an example of that. But then there's this third level, which is how the criminal law is being experienced. And that really relates to enforcement. And in a variety of our comparative readings that we've been looking at in relation to our primary text. And of course, this lecture series, we've realized that uh, law and the enforcement of law is very much experienced differently across a society, and how that legal system is being experienced is going to be something that ultimately will create almost a systematic feedback or a system of feedback for people who are experiencing not only crime but the enforcement of law. So, as you can see, when you're talking about conflict theory and you're looking through this sociological lens, you're also looking at something that is not going to be static in nature. Because up to this point, we've come to realize that the values that a society is built around, values that are part of our culture, values that are part of how we are socialized as individuals, values that connect to our psychology, our sense of identity, so on and so forth, these values are going to change over time. All you have to do is sit down with your family and ask a simple question to people of a variety of different generations within that family structure. You could bring up something like marriage. And you could say, okay, so what are some of the basic principles that marriage is established upon? What does marriage look like? Um, how is marriage experienced? Right? You start to ask some of these basic, almost institutional questions, and you will start to see the changing social values as they relate to generations, even within a single household, how that topic is being considered differently by people. Um, and you could even include, gender as part of this process too. So not only age becomes um, a means of being able to see changing social values, but then even other aspects, vital aspects of life, such as gender, how that also is something that will result in a different experience as it relates to even a primary social value. And then the experience doesn't stop there. When we look even deeper into this subject and start to look at some of the different theoretical schools that are kind of growing out of historic conflict theory, we start to see that there are different views that relate to how people, in a sense, understand conduct um, and what they expect from the conduct of others. So there is conduct that is considered to be wrong, and this can be experienced inside or even outside of a legal framework. So, if, for example, you are applying a religious value to conduct, then, and we go back to something like marriage, the religious view of conduct within a relationship and how that relationship is understood biologically and sociologically, we may find different kinds of conflicting values there. And then, of course, a resulting kind of coercion, or maybe a better word to use would be a resolution to how people are going to experience relationships, how that is then resolved. And then there's conduct that is generally prohibited by society itself, by the majority of society. And this second kind of understanding of conduct and how we are saying that, well, the conduct is wrong or considered to be wrong or should be considered wrong, this is where we start to move into criminal law. And so, and you can see that there's not a clear line here between conduct that is generally viewed to be wrong by different segments of a society, and then ultimately in how those segments are being defined, and then how conduct is considered wrong and is connected to criminal law to prevent that conduct, right? How there are conflicts between even those two perspectives. Another example would be a topic like abortion or capital punishment, right? These and that you know it, these kinds of topics are low-hanging fruit because not only do they, um, I guess, identify or depict the kind of conflict that I'm trying to share with you here as part of this lecture, but there are also things that we can immediately relate to just because we are seeing these kinds of conflicts by issue occurring in modern society as well. So the idea here is that you know infanticide or capital punishment are these things that should be legislated in a way that they are prohibited from all members of a society and even the institutions themselves in the case of capital punishment? Or are these things that should be uh, left to a kind of conflict resolution that occurs more within a philosophical theater as opposed to a public one or a legal judicial one? So this is an ongoing kind of debate, and we see it change as the society historically changes as well. So then the final piece of the puzzle here really relates to how a criminologist will apply conflict theory in his or her own research. And I think where this is in itself resolved is when we start to understand something about cultures and subcultures. Now, the term subculture can also be juxtaposed with the term that I have here on this slide, which is a societal segment or segments of a society. Generally, in sociological circles, a subculture is recognized to encapsulate the values and related behaviors of a group that distinguishes itself in some way, shape, or form from the larger culture. Now, sometimes the values themselves and the behaviors themselves can be that means uh, of distinction, but generally there will be a wide range, even geographical or even physiological kinds of characteristics that allow a subculture to distinguish itself. But generally, we're looking at a world within a world when we're talking about a subculture or a segment of society. How crime is being experienced by different segments of a society and by people who are distinguishing themselves on a subcultural level is a very important factor when we're looking at the application of conflict theory. So the idea here of, again, applications of contact theory, or conflict theory rather, will focus on how different groups within a society, those that have a system of values and behaviors that are part of how they define themselves, how they are experiencing crime, but more importantly, given our focus in conflict theory, how they are connecting to criminal law in a differential way. So, and this is where, again, a postmodern theoretical framework is very, very much connected to this theory, system of theory. How do women, for example, or minorities experience or fit into the legal system in a similar or different fashion? How does a majority, in a sense, express itself within a criminal justice system? How does a political or religious point of view or philosophical framework express itself and connect with criminal law over time? How does a socioeconomic subculture or segment within a society experience crime and experience uh, the prohibition of crime a little differently? So there's many different angles then that we can start to look at this through, and that's a point that I really would like to make sure that you have a deeper understanding of when we're talking about postmodernism as it relates to sociological theory and of course theory in other disciplines. It has less to do with a political agenda. Today, postmodernism has been connected to political and social agendas. That's a little different. That's more of a popular cultural reference. In this case, when I'm talking about postmodernism, is the theory or theories that force the individual using that frame of reference to look at things from a different angle. Right? So the idea that you and I could look at the same kinds of basic data elements, but how we then organize that data and what kind of hypothesis we choose to test may vary based upon our theoretical framework. So if I am looking, for example, at power and agency as it relates to crime rates in a particular socioeconomic group, I may have a completely different perspective or look at the subject from a different angle, even one that I don't necessarily connect with, given my membership within a society. But I look at it through that different angle, and I don't necessarily see different data, but what I see is a different means of explaining a trend within that data. Or I use it to focus on a subset of the data that applies to a particular demographic group. So just keep that in mind as you're as I use the term postmodernism or as postmodernism is discussed in your readings. And then the final distinction to make as part of this look at criminology and conflict theory is that you have different levels of conflict that relate to culture clashes. So you have, in a sense, primary and secondary levels of conflict that further break down data that you may be collecting in order to test a research hypothesis. So a primary conflict would relate to how subcultures conflict with one another based upon their core values or the behaviors that they come to expect of their members. Um, or it could be between cultures. Let's say there are societies that are geographically or historically separated from one another, how their varying views regarding consensus and conflict result in different applications of law or different laws themselves. So that's more primary. And then the other level is secondary. Secondary is usually occurring within a single culture, within a single society over time. So as the culture changes and as some of the core values change in relation to maybe a majority within that society in terms of majority voice, how conflict is identified and resolved through the formulation of criminal law or law itself, the rule of law in a sense, and then also how that is being experienced, how that results in a prohibition of particular kinds of behaviors that are considered to be deviant in nature.